of Legend of the Five Rings is a series of interviews celebrating 3 decades since the debut of L5R at Gen Con 1995. In this second series of the Play to Win podcast from Aconyte Books, we'll explore the perspectives of the people who had a hand in the franchise's making, past and present, the lasting impacts L5R has had on their lives, and what about L5R has made it an enduring force in the tabletop games industry after all these years. I'm your host, Katrina Ostrander, and I'm the creative director of story and setting with the franchise development team at Asmodee. I've had the privilege of working on L5R in various roles since 2015, including as writer, fiction editor, RPG developer, and story lead. In my current role, I help oversee the brand's development as it expands further into novels, comic books, video games, board games, and more. But before that, I was simply a big fan of the setting. In this episode, I continue my conversation with Legend of the Five Rings co-creators John Zinser and Ryan Dancey of Alderac Entertainment Group. I get their take on what gave L5R its staying power, a behind-the-scenes look at some of the most memorable and challenging products they produced, and how a miraculous discovery in the Shadowlands saved the game from an untimely demise. So let's jump back in. So thank you so much for rejoining me. I'm really grateful to have you back.
No problem. Thanks for having us.
Glad to be here.
So I wanted to take a step back and look at the bigger picture and ask, what do you think made L5R so special that it was able to endure as a brand for 30 years?
Well, the first thing that I always tell people is that it was good. The game was good. It was designed by a guy who turned out to be a genius at game design, Dave Williams. But Dave was young and smart enough to understand that he needed to work with a team of people. And so that game is a collaborative effort. It had a great leader in Dave, but Dave was assisted by a lot of people that helped him make that game as good as it could be. And that is true for every aspect of that game. The art is amazing, and it's because Matt Wilson was an incredible artist and an incredible art director, but then he listened to and took feedback from a lot of people. John Wick is an amazing storyteller, but he listened to and took feedback from a lot of people. So it starts from a foundation that the product was just really good.
Yeah, I agree with that. It is still one of the best games. I've been making games for, well, as long as we made L5R, 30 years. And it is the best game I think that we have ever made. I do think that the intersection of how great a game it was, the time, that L5R was sort of forced to try and survive to actually make it out of the CCG era when so many games were not making it. Fan interaction that the game had meant that more than just the 10 people that were working on it at AEG and ISO Media were putting it out there into the zeitgeist. I mean, before I came back on today, the interview, I went to my Facebook page and just posted that I had an interview about the L5R 30th anniversary. And it was my most, people just came out of the woodwork to talk about all the things that they loved about L5R and make sure I didn't forget certain people during the interview. It was great.
That's wonderful. Yeah. So you talk about the game being good, but I'm wondering if there are particular products that you think were standouts among the game's history or products that you're the most proud of individually.
I mean, I think that we whiteboarded out a whole bunch of different ideas for different games. And L5R, we talked about how to make a samurai game. And we talked about one-on-one dueling and a number of different things. But once we landed on the idea that it was great clans fighting each other and that the game itself was a war game, that made the game very different, right? Like you were doing some of the similar things that you did in other games. Personalities were coming into your spheres of influence is what they were called, until 2 weeks before the game went to press, when one of my friends said, "Why don't you call these provinces?" We're like, "Oh, duh, they are provinces." So characters would come out of your provinces, and then you would attach, troops to them and weapons and items, and then you would go fight battles at the different provinces, and the rules of the war game sort of pervaded through the card game itself. And it worked so well with the ultimate story that we were telling that I think the core game itself was so good that the expansions did what expansions were supposed to do. They let you sort of break the rules of the game in unique and fun and interesting, focused clan ways. Mm-hmm. But I think that the base of the game was so good that I can't pick an expansion that I think did something for the actual gameplay. I mean, all the expansions had amazing storyline connections that I'll never forget. But as far as game is concerned, I think the game was just really good to start with.
Is there a particular expansion that like represented like a trial or tribulation that you had to overcome that was like particularly challenging to get into the world?
The first one and the last one. Shadowlands was an expansion that we didn't know how we were going to pay to print when we made it.
Yep.
And being able to produce it was a function of getting the deal done to create Five Rings Publishing and bring in some outside investment money and form that company out of the original joint venture. And then we made Time of the Void, the last expansion, after Wizards of the Coast had bought Five Rings Publishing. And so it was created during the time that we were trying to fold our whole organization into Wizards, and they were trying to learn how to have us be a part of them, and we were trying to learn how to be a part of, how for us to be a part of them too. So yeah, those two things were they were very difficult to achieve. The three in the middle were kind of easy. We knew what we wanted to do, and I mean, there was huge design and art issues, but that's just the work of making them. But we knew what we wanted to do, and we knew how to do them, and we did them. Mm-hmm. But the first one and the last one were tough.
Yeah, I agree with Ryan. The journey from Imperial Edition to Shadowlands was a long, hard, arduous journey of demos and making friends and doing all of that stuff. So that was definitely the most memorable expansion. Once we had formed Five Rings Publishing Group, we were excited that we knew that we were going to get to the end of our story arc.
Mm-hmm. For me, the thing that I am the most proud of is the Battle of Baden Pass. I personally spent a lot of time on that product and working on the text that went into the material that was in the box and playtesting the decks and just trying to make the whole thing work. It was one of the first starter sets or intro sets for a trading card game, because up to that point, the starter deck, the thing that you bought, was the thing you got first. It was kind of like, well, why would you need to make a starter set or a two-player game? That's what the deck is. But obviously, it's so difficult to learn how to play one of these things from the little tiny rule book you get in that little deck that we decided to try and do something different. And that was where Battle of Baden Pass came from.
So had the tournament results for Baden Pass already come in? Like, had you planned on those decks kind of informing who would go in that product? Or do you remember like kind of how that all coalesced?
My memory is that we were relatively sure that some of the factions had no chance of winning. And so we didn't have to worry about them. And if it had happened, we would have figured it out. But I think we kind of thought that it was going to be crane, crab, dragon, or lion. And so we were able to think about that pretty far out. I can remember having some conversations with Dave Williams about thinking about the cards that we would want to have in the decks if it was one of those four clans, in a very informal conversation. I can't even remember the context of it, but we had been thinking kind of about what would go in it, and we had a reasonably good idea of what it was likely to be before we started working on it.
Yeah, it's the Crab Shadowlands decks are always really fascinating to me because, like, on the one hand, like, it's a war game, so you can play the bad guys, and on the other hand, it's like, oh, like they're not doing what the rest of the great clans are doing.
Yeah, that particular product had to do double duty, and it was a bit of a storyline thing, and it was also really designed to help people who didn't have access to any other play group figure out how to play this game. So we really couldn't put a lot of weird, complicated stuff in there, although I say that knowing that there is plenty of weird, complicated stuff in that box. There's some weird stuff in there. And I really probably couldn't even tell you why at this point, other than that we thought it was a good idea at the time.
Yeah, I think a lot about the different deck archetypes that sort of popped up as we were, doing new expansions. And, when you're designing, like we're a board game company now. We've focused on board games for a while, and the sort of modus operandi of people that buy board games is that we want to play the games and have fun and we want to win, but it's like sort of a group moment that we all get together and play games. There's always somebody that's the best player in the group and they win most of the time. But in a collectible trading card game, your players are trying to break the game. They are looking for every edge that they can get when they come to play. Mm-hmm. And it was our first collectible trading card game. And the simplest little things broke the game in the early days, or broke the game. I'm using air quotes as I say that. we put a really simple character in the Lion clan that was get +2 when you go into, I think it was Matsugohai, which was sort of an innocuous little bonus character. And that character became like the impetus of what the players started calling the Lion Speed Deck, which people showed up at Kotai events with this deck that they had worked on prior to the events that would win in 3 turns.
Wow.
I mean, it was so fast. The players called it the LSD deck, and it was scary. I think
Lion Speed Deck.
Yeah. That was the first deck that we had to, retcon and try to figure out how we were going to deal with the fact that we had built this game of players who had identified with clans, and all of them wanted to have access to decks that could win at any one time. And so the toughest time about putting out expansions is that every time you put out expansions, certain clans got more powerful because you were always trying to put cards into the environment that would balance things out. And the players didn't care, right? They were like, okay, so you've balanced it in this way. Now the crab's the most powerful deck in the game. You balance this out of the game. Now the crane's the most powerful deck in the game. And there was it was amazing how many crazy things players did with the game that we didn't even see or expect to have happen.
One of the challenges I think of playtesting for competitive games is adapting to the meta and how people take and run with, what you're playing, but also the infinite complexity of hundreds of cards interacting with hundreds of cards. You never find the really tricky thing until after it's printed, it seems like.
Nope.
Guaranteed. I think every card game has to grapple with that on some level. L5R certainly wasn't immune.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so we ran a reasonably famous ad back in the early days of L5R. There was Wizards of the Coast went through a moment where they were having to deal with that, and they got to a point where they started banning cards. They were like, "Oh, we've got cards in the environment that are so broken that it's causing people to not buy our game, and so we're going to start banning cards." And we did a tongue-in-cheek sort of marketing campaign that sort of played off of that. And one of our most famous ads from the good old days was 900 cards, 0 broken, 0 banned.
Yes, and did the fans, I guess, did you ever get to hear anyone's reaction? Did you get any angry mail that you had, led them astray?
Well, we had the opposite in that we had people that took it as a promise that we weren't going to ever ban a card. Their default attitude was, we play the game that doesn't have banned cards.
Yes. So they did get mad when we finally had to start errating and banning cards.
I see.
Yeah, we did a lot of word games. So, so one of the rules that came into effect for floor rules for tournaments relatively early is that you use the most currently printed version of a card. So if we found a mistake, we would fix it if we printed that card again. And then all of the cards with that card name were supposed to be played according to the most recently printed version of that card. So it was our way of basically saying, if you spent a lot of money to buy this card as a single, we are not going to make that card useless. But we are also not going to be bound by the fact that we made a typo or got a number wrong. And now for all time, this card is completely unusable. We're going to fix it in some way that doesn't involve us, removing whatever value you might attach to what you paid or what you did to get that card. Yeah, that was how we fixed Matsugohai, I'm pretty sure, is we reprinted that card with much lower stats.
Interesting. But I feel like that presents its own challenges in a pre-internet age, whereas now I can hop on whatever card game database for your, card game and get the, accurate information. And then I'm trying to imagine what that would be like where I'm playing, my 1-year-old Matsugohei, and then somebody else is playing across from me a different version.
Yeah.
That sounds a little like chaos.
I mean, the good news is that it affected a relatively small number of cards, and they were so obvious.
I see.
You probably just knew that the card was not right.
MRP'd.
Yeah.
MRP, what does that stand for?
Most recently printed.
Okay.
But I'm certain there are people who sat down to play at tournaments and were shocked to discover that whatever wacky thing they were prepared to do was no longer allowed because a card had gotten printed somewhere. Like I'm sure that it happened. I don't believe we ever really had to remove a character from the game. I don't think that ever happened. I don't think we ever changed a character so much that it was not what was reflected. Like almost all of the time when these things happen, it was a costing issue. How much gold does it cost?
I see.
And we gave some characters amazing death, and we gave other characters horrible story deaths. And famously, Hideyakumo's first death was not a very good. I think that's who it was. The Crab Clan champion's first death was horrible. And then in a later set, were able to bring him back and give him a much, much better death. And so that's sort of a retcon that we were able to do to the story arc, not to the gameplay, which made the players happy. That they were always mad when we killed their characters, but they were really mad if their characters died in a really lame sort of, oh, by the way kind of way.
Yeah.
In terms of like when characters died, were these primarily conveyed in the Imperial Herald recaps that came out, or were there other places that fans found out about, like the fate of the storyline, if you recall?
I think initially a lot of the information was put into the early heralds, but the internet was just dawning at that time. And L5R players were sort of at the forefront of groups and that other stuff. So there were enough L5R players that when something would happen, the rest of the world would sort of find out through these, chat rooms and places that I couldn't get into now, and I definitely couldn't get into then. So there was a reasonably high level of communication amongst players and the people who worked at our company, who were also pretty tech savvy when it came to that stuff. Ryan, that was the business he was in prior to getting into the board gaming business. So he knew all about, how to connect people in that way, and was his business, Isomedia, was about bringing the internet to the people of Seattle. So
just to kind of lay out what happened, if you were a member of the Imperial Assembly, the fan club, you would get a newsletter, which was actually a little magazine. It was printed. I know this is like shocking. We actually physically made these things. And then based on what clan you told us you identified with when you signed up for the newsletter, you would also usually get a letter from somebody important in your clan that told you the most recent events as they were viewed or understood by your clan. And so in order to get the full picture, you had to find somebody who had all the letters from all of the clans that you weren't a part of.
Oh, yeah.
And so, obviously people would just post the text on the internet, but a lot of people didn't really have access to that resource. They would gather at conventions and compare these letters or go to their game store. People would, I'm sure, would sign up for all of the clans, so they would get all of the letters.
Yeah, the Wizards of the Coast thing definitely happened to us in there. We were like, oh, this will be great. Like, people will have to share what's going on with their clans. And then some players were like, nope, I've got 9 clan memberships, so I get all of the clan letters.
Yeah.
And so, 9 Imperial Heralds would be mailed to the same address.
Yeah. So that was one way that you got some storyline, regular storyline update. The rule books themselves had storyline content in them. So every time you got a new expansion starter deck, that deck usually had a couple of pages of story, almost like, okay, here's an expansion and here's why you're going to see the cards that you're going to see. So we would try to have that material available. There were probably some cards that had storyline content that wasn't reflected anywhere else in writing.
Flavor text.
And so you would just see the card and go, oh, that's a thing that happened. And you might have no idea what it meant or why, or you just knew that somewhere, somehow, this thing had happened that mattered in some way, and you could see the output, but you didn't necessarily know the input. And then I think there also was just a fair bit of a bunch of guys in an office would make up some cool thing, tell each other it was cool. It would get reflected in art or something. But was it formally written down and conveyed to the community in any way? Probably not. Like, you're hanging out with John Wick at the bar at a convention, and he tells you some nugget about the Naga, and John remembers it's in his mind, and he might do something with it later. But you had a conversation with the guy, and he told you it was a thing. And so, was it a thing? Sure, it was a thing. for you? Was it a thing for us? Maybe. Was it definitively a thing? No, it was not definitive. Right. So there was this kind of oral tradition, oral history that was going on where people were kind of exchanging these anecdotes. And a lot of people loved it. And some people absolutely hated it. It made some people very angry. I was told by Ryan Dancey that this Scorpion Clan guy was dead. And now he's in an expansion. What? I was lied to. Like, oh my God, come on.
But it's the Scorpion Clan.
Right. We're not that organized. Yeah. There was a lot of 95.5. 95% of the people, 95% of the time were very happy and excited and enjoyed it and kind of knew what it was and understood it. And then there was 5% of the people, 5% of the time, that it really made them angry.
But probably because they cared about it so deeply.
Yeah.
I cared about it so much. Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
Right. If they didn't care, they wouldn't have gotten angry.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah.
It seems like a good segue because we're kind of like getting into some concrete memories as well. You know, this is a pretty open-ended question, so I'll let you give as many answers as you like. But could you share with us a couple of favorite memories of working on L5R or interacting with the fan community that have stayed with you after all these years?
Yeah, I became really good friends with an artist named William O'Connor. Bill O'Connor was a famous L5R artist who is no longer with us. But he did 300 or 400 different cards for us, almost 300 cards, I think, in the Legend of the Five Rings game. And we became, really good friends over time. And he was beloved by the players of L5R.
It's some of the most iconic art, I would say.
Iconic art. And he was so good at working so fast, right? Like, if you look at Bill's art, it is built in such a way that the main character in the art is clear and perfect. Like, he did artwork that was perfect for card-sized art because he could do it fast, because he realized that when it got shrunk down to a 1x2 image, that you didn't need to have all sorts of hyper perfection inside the card, because most of that just disappeared as the card shrunk down. And so there were a lot of things, like he would do pieces with like 15 characters in them in like a phalanx position. And the front character had pretty reasonable detail. But as you went further back, it was just like dots on the thing. But you could just tell that it was a line of samurai on the card, which was amazing. I think that in the early days, like early Wizards of the Coast offered artists a percentage because they couldn't afford to get artists to come work on their game. And then that percentage like immediately turned into life-changing money because Magic, became Magic the Gathering. And we were paying, I don't remember how much we were paying per card initially, but it was like nothing. It was peanuts. And the people who were art directing for us after Matt, they would get really frustrated that we would find these talented artists and basically discover them and give them their first pieces of art that were ever published. And then they would come to me and say, John, we have to find a way to pay these artists more money because we're losing them to Magic the Gathering and we're losing them to these other games. And I was like, listen, our journey is to constantly be discovering the new talent. And we are their first step into the gaming industry. We discovered Matt Wilson, William O'Connor, Steve Argyle, Drew, I can't think of his last name now. Like these artists are legendary artists who've gone on to do art for D&D and for Magic the Gathering and a bunch of other games. And their first piece of art was published by Alderac Entertainment Group, Five Rings Publishing Group. And the great art directors really sort of understood that, right? They were always on the hunt to find new artists, but it didn't make them feel any better when they would find an artist and they'd be like, oh, we're totally gonna lose this guy to other games. And I was like, listen, you find an artist that great, order as many pieces as you can from them, right? And then happily help them move on to a job that's paying them more than what we're paying them to do the art. And so I'm really proud of the careers that L5R and some of our other games launched on the art side.
Absolutely. It's like the character design alone is just so memorable. Like those characters are still inspiring players to this day.
Yep.
And I was going to ask, is Drew Baker the name of the other artist?
Drew Baker. Sorry, Drew. We sort of pigeonholed Drew. Like, he drew strongholds better than anybody that had ever drawn strongholds for us. And so we had him drawing strongholds for a long time. And he would occasionally get to do other art, but we didn't realize until later that when he actually started doing, dragons and characters in the game, that they were as good or better than some of the art that we actually had in the game. But nobody could do strongholds as well as Drew did, because he put so much character and interest into them, and he fantasied them up in a way that they're like, oh, if this is Scorpion Clan stronghold, it just looks like a building. But when Drew did it, it was like a secret hidden base in the side of a mountain that just was like oozing scorpion with the logos and all that stuff. So I am really happy that we got a chance to work with him and the many other artists that just really made L5R amazing.
Some of these, like the prints, are still available for sale by the artists. So that's very cool.
Yeah, I think it was really great that the art community sort of blossomed up around Gen Con, and people would go to events. And as the Kotai started happening, they started inviting artists to come to the Kotais. And a few artists like Drew and Steve were at the forefront of making prints and going to Kotais and signing their art. And they forged a sort of path forward for them to actually make a reasonably good living doing artwork for card games at the rates that we were able to pay them. But then they became fan favorites, and they would sell all sorts of prints online and at conventions and stuff. So it was great. Drew's the master at that. He still goes to conventions and sells his originals and prints for tons.
Collector's prices now, I would say.
Yep,
yeah,
absolutely.
How about you, Ryan? Do you have any favorite memories of working on L5R or favorite interactions with the fan community?
Yeah, I have lots of weird memories of things, that some of which was public and some of which wasn't public. Like in 1995, when we were getting ready to release the game, we did a preview release of the game at Gen Con that year. And the preview cards were handed out as decks, but they were not printed as decks. So what happened was Yaquinto printed cards ahead of the real print run for the Imperial Edition. And then a couple of guys got in a truck and they drove from California to Texas to the Yaquinto factory. They picked those cards up, which were packed in these long black plastic trays with one card per tray. So the tray would have like 2,000 cards, and it'd be 2,000 copies of the same card. Boxes and boxes of those trays, drove that truck to
Gen Con,
Wisconsin, to Milwaukee.
Oh, no.
And they got there the day before the show. And then that night, we set out all of these trays on a bunch of tables at our hotel in the kitchen area, they have a break room or a little breakfast area. So we had all these tables set up and we had all these cards lined up. And then I had brought 6 people from Seattle to be in the booth, and AEG had about 6 people. And we just walked around this table, around and around and around. And you just, the recipe was, you take 2 from this tray and 1 from this tray and 3 from this tray. And when you got all the way done walking all the way around the table, you had a complete deck. And then that went into a box or got rubber banded or something, thrown into a bin.
That must be the most intense deck building experience ever.
Yeah. So we hand built 2,000 decks for that promotion. There was 2 decks, so it was 4,000 total decks. And then of course, people at the show that year, if they came and they sat and they did a demo, they got those decks. You can distinguish them from the Imperial Edition cards. They have the border around the card is inverted. So in Imperial Edition, the border was yellow and gold, red and gold.
Yellow and red. Yeah.
And you can tell the difference between the preview cards and the real cards because they just flipped the graphic, but they were printed badly. And it was our error, not Yaquinto's error. We didn't really understand how to do the proper settings in the pre-press portion of the tool we were using.
Wow.
And so the cards were slightly not printed correctly. And when you're printing multicolor on a press, if you get that wrong, you can see the little rosettes, the dots of ink. If you look really carefully, you can see them. They don't just go away and become the normal color palette you would see. And if we hadn't made those cards, that's what would have been printed for the Imperial Edition, and all of those cards would have been lower quality than they should have been. But because we did that preview set, we saw that error and we fixed it, and we were able to make those Imperial Edition cards as good as they were.
Ryan and I contacted Peter Atkinson before like we went to press and said, what's one piece of advice that you would give us? And he said, print a practice sheet. And so his advice basically, like, we were like, oh, holy mackerel. We learned so much by printing that practice sheet. And the practice sheet was one of the reasons why L5R was one of the games that successfully sold enough product during that time when games were dying. It just, like, amazing advice. Like, the simplest thing, made such a big deal in that game.
Yeah. So then the next year, 1996, which was the first full year that the game had been available for sale. And that was the year that there was going to be that championship at the booth for the first time, the first World Championship. John and I decided that we were going to give away $100,000 of decks, that we were going to have this huge promotion. We were going to basically try to give everybody that went to Gen Con that year a starter deck. So to put this in context, Magic comes out in 93, and their booth in 93 is just a sales booth. They had a couple of guys sitting behind a table with a credit card machine selling Magic cards as fast as they could sell them. That was the whole booth. The next year, 1994, is the first year when trading card games are a thing, and everybody has kind of seen the success of Magic. And so the first generation of trading card game companies show up at Gen Con, and they cloned what Wizards did. Their booths were just a guy sitting behind a table with a credit card machine selling cards. The third year, 95, is the year we did the preview decks. And most of the people who had come in at the same time we were had cloned what the people did in the second year. They had a booth that was just a guy sitting behind a table with a credit card machine. We were doing demos in our booth. Like, that was our whole strategy, was doing demos. And we paid a lot of money in context to Gen Con to get space to set up these demo tables and do these demos. And a lot of people looked at us and they thought, that is insane. Like, you are paying a ton of money to Gen Con and you're not selling product. You're just teaching people how to play the game. Like, you're not making money from that space, right? But it worked out. It was really good. So then the next year, 95, 96, that was the year when we said, well, now we're going to take this to the next level. We're going to do this crazy promotion. We're going to give away $100,000 worth of starter decks. So now, our Gen Con expense was truly insane, but really it was $100,000 of retail value. And the way publishing works is the cost of goods on an item is usually about 1/5 of the retail value. So it was about $20,000 of marketing expense to do this demo thing. But people really thought we'd lost our minds. Like, that is just crazy talk that you're going to do this thing. But I think it's one of the reasons that the brand just kind of took off, because so many people who might have heard about it in the first year and really didn't know what it was, then they got those decks at Gen Con and they could sit down, they could learn how to play, and the World Championship was happening and people were all clustered around the booth, and it kind of created this moment of, what is this thing? Oh, well, I've got it. I can go home and try to figure out what it is. I can play with my friends, right? It was just this kind of building thing. It was always focused on, how do we take this game to the masses? How do we get more people to play it? How do we get people that are curious to give it a shot and take a risk on it? How do we get a retailer to say, wow, that looks like something I want to have in my store? Like, I'm going to spend some effort on becoming a part of whatever this is, right? So just a lot of memories I have around that kind of progression of getting bigger, constantly pushing. And then, of course, the Day of Thunder is like the capstone and all of that. Yeah. It was like everything we had learned over the previous 3 years on how to do an event at Gen Con, it all culminated at the Day of Thunder. But it took all those little building blocks to get up to that point. We couldn't have just gone into Gen Con and done the Day of Thunder. We would have had no idea how to do it.
And that deck giveaway became sort of a focused thing that sort of was a pillar in AEG's CCG era. Our company gave away over 1 million decks during the 10 years that we were publishing collectible trading cards. And it all started with that L5R giveaway. And then from there, like, we always printed extra decks and we were always giving away demo decks, because I was very fond of saying sampling works when your product doesn't suck.
Right.
That was an amazing time. And I've forgotten how much fun it was to give away those decks. And the magic thing about L5R is, like, if you'd sit across the table from somebody, you could tell if they were getting sucked into the demo, right? Like 1 in 4 people, like, there would be a moment where they would attach a card to a character and they would be like, oh, and you would see, or like, okay, you're in. Like I could leave the table now, and you would sit here and want to continue to play and go buy things. So demos really worked for L5R.
My job here is done. Yeah.
I think that in relation to your question, I do think that the Legend of the Five Rings role-playing game and the storyline team is often the forgotten child of the CCG era and the story of Legend of the Five Rings. After John Wick, we had a young lady named Bree Sosby, who was an unbelievable writer, great storyteller that came in and took over for him. And she was a different kind of storyteller than John was. John was a sort of an orator, shoot from the hip kind of person who could tell a story. And Ree was very deep, a lot of character background and that sort of stuff, which is what L5R needed at that point in its life cycle. And the role-playing game team, and I'm not going to get all of them, was Ree Sosby, Sean Carman, Rich Wolf, Fred Wan, Dave Latteroot, who was the brand manager for the game for a while, Robert Denton, who did a whole bunch of fiction at a time when nobody was given the fiction writers any credit. Kevin Millard, who was an employee at the company, he had so much talent. And he was just so quiet and just did all of the work that we didn't realize while he was at the company, just how much stuff he was actually doing. And then Rusty Prisk and a few other people who really sort of poured their heart and soul into the part of the game that connected people at the deepest possible level. And for us, L5R would not be what it is today without that story and that connectivity of the fans. And, if I could go back in time and change one thing about the way I looked at the way the game was growing at that time, I was very focused on the product and the CCG element. And I knew that the story was sort of connective tissue. And I would talk in big picture stuff, but I didn't really give kudos at the level that it was deserved to the people who just filled in all of the meat on the bones, told all of those stories, connected with players. They would show up at tournaments and walk around the CCG tournaments and connect with the players who were cosplaying as different characters and showing up. And then they would go home and write the stories about what they saw happening inside the games in their connection with the players. It was such a unique and deep way to connect with a story. I can't say enough nice things about those folks.
And I think to this day, I don't know of many, if any, other card games that have done anything comparable in terms of the dedication of the story teams and the writers. And if you flip through those first edition Way of the Clans books and you see the incredible creativity that people poured forth into them, they still hold up. Reading them is still a blast.
Yep, it's crazy. It's crazy how good that stuff is. So in the early days, we put Koku on the card backs. It's like a proof of purchase that you've bought a booster pack or a deck box. And people collected those. And in the Imperial Herald, we would list rare cards that you could send 20 Koku to AEG along with a stamped envelope, and we would send you cards for your Koku. And at the time, that was just sort of an, oh, by the way, cool little thing that we did. We thought that players would like doing it, but players collected the Koku. I mean, we would host events, sealed deck events, and people would walk around with trash bags, grabbing up all the wrappers and taking them home with them. And during the Race to the Throne, we were like, oh, there's probably a lot of Koku out there. What we're going to do is we're going to offer people to bid on storyline prizes and to send in their Koku to do stuff. And we got so much Koku that it was like leaves in the fall in the back of our office. We got people sending in thousands of wrappers in bags and boxes. I mean, and we got so much of it that, again, I wish I had pictures of this, but we poured it all out on the floor and we laid in it. And the players did the most amazing things. They would hand sew mantis bags to put all of the Koku in and send it. Some people actually took all of their Koku out and pasted it on cards and sent it in little racks so that this is exactly 1,000 koku 15 times, right? And I'm like, who has the amount of time to hand glue every one of these, koku stickers to cards in such an organized way?
I was going to ask, who has the time to count all of your koku wrappers?
We didn't count all of them at that point. It was just
weigh them at that point.
Crazy. Yeah, we could have. But yeah, there was a race amongst the clans to send in the most kotai to win a big storyline effect during that story. The kotais were all very focused on earning points in the race for the throne. The world championship that we hosted in LA that year was the first. It was a true world championship. We worked hard to get players from all of the different countries who had won their national events into that tournament. Pablo Roja was one of the great L5R players who had never won a championship. It was like a great football player in Europe who everybody knew was the greatest player at the time, but he had never won a championship, and he won the Samurai Championships in LA.
Wow.
It was everything that L5R could be in that moment, right? It was not quite the Day of Thunder because the Day of Thunder was so new and unknown, but it was the height of our powers in telling a connected storyline era and culminating it with, a big CCG event.
Mm-hmm. I was going to wait to see, Ryan, if you had anything you wanted to add on to that thought.
Not about that in particular, but I want to talk about the Scorpion Clan coup.
Okay. This is a topic near and dear to my heart. I'm ready to sit patiently and listen. Yes.
So we all know that there was this long lifetime of product going down until Asmodee took ownership of the brand. But there was a moment when it was possible that none of that would ever happen. So when we designed the game and wrote the original plan for what we were going to do, Legend of the Five Rings was going to have an ending, and it was going to be over. And we produced a conclusion set, not an expansion set, in Time of the Void. It is the end of the story. And the story and the game were inextricably connected. And so there was something of a commitment made to our community, and we told people explicitly, this game will come to an end. And there were a lot of people who bought into that idea. They were not interested in being married to a brand for the rest of their life. They wanted to have a relationship with it that had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And we promised them that that is what was going to happen with Legend of the Five Rings. And I don't think John and I have ever really talked publicly about this before in any detail, and certainly probably not in any recorded venue. But the two of us are the people who made the decision to break that promise.
We had a fight over it.
Yeah, we didn't decide to break that promise until almost the very end of the first arc of the story. Up until late into into 1997, we were going to end that game. It was going to have an ending. We talked about what we would do with Legend of the Five Rings after that. It was going to become a role-playing game. We were going to pursue a computer game license. We talked about things like, what if we did far future L5R with mecha? We followed the anime pathway and said, what other cool anime things could we do with this brand? But we were pretty committed to the idea that it was going to end. And there are definitely people out there on record, Matt Colville is one of them, who have talked to people close to the team, including John and myself during that era, and we're told, oh yeah, it's ending. And I just want people to hear, it was ending. We really did intend to end that game and that story, and it was going to be over. I think there was a little bit of a hope that Shadowlands would win the Day of Thunder and we would have the 1,000 Years of Darkness, because it would be relatively easy to tell the fans we're going to do a 1,000 Years of Darkness product without kind of breaking faith. Behind the scenes, the community knows that AEG and Isomedia had formed a joint venture to make the game, and then we created this company, Five Rings Publishing, and then that company got bought by Wizards of the Coast. Well, it was going to be pretty difficult to tell people at Wizards of the Coast that we were just going to stop making this wildly successful thing, arguably the only other successful trading card game ever made that doesn't have a license attached to it. That was going to be a pretty tough sell. And I was working for a guy at the time named Rich Fukutaki, who was the vice president of a group called New Brand Development and Licensing. And Rich, he figured this out really early on, starting early in the year in 1997, when it became clear that this deal was going to happen. He and I were having conversations about what exactly it is we're going to do and what have we promised people and what are we going to say when we get to the Day of Thunder about the future of this game. And that kind of leads into the fight that John was alluding to. He and I were really struggling to decide what to do next after the Time of the Void. Do you want to step in here, John?
I think that one of the things that we had sort of counted on early on was that we realized that the storyline element of the game was such a powerful hook that we also talked about moving on to cowboys and then pirates and then spies and telling stories around those games. What we didn't count on was how hard it was to replicate the game mechanics that would work for those games. Now, we ultimately ended up making Toontown and 7th Sea, and those games had mechanics that were very much thematic for those properties. But at the time we were getting close to the end of L5R, we had started working on Doomtown, but it wasn't even close to being done. It was still a year away from being a product that you could play at that point. And so we had a real sort of crisis of what to do next. And I remember us fighting about the promise to the players and how much that meant to us and breaking their trust. And we both went back and forth. And I think I was on we have to continue doing L5R side more often than Ryan was. And Ryan was on we have made a promise that we must keep to the players. People who work with us have been amazed at how passionate the two of us can fight.
We scream at each other.
They've been in the rooms with us where we start screaming at each other.
We're like an old married couple.
To make the other one understand our point of view. And then when the screaming ends, we just go get dinner, right? They're like, oh my God, we're okay interacting that way because we're so passionate about our ideas. And so we ended up screaming at each other a few times over this. And then we made the decision through Rich and talking to the people at Wizards of the Coast about doing the Scorpion. Like we could go back and retell the story that sort of led into.
Yeah. So we didn't have a plan. We did not have a story for what happens after the Day of Thunder. There was no story. So if we were going to tell people that we were going to have product releases for this game after the Day of Thunder, we were going to have to basically boot a whole story process from scratch and hope that we could come up with something that was good enough to produce all of the necessary material to do game design and art direction and all that stuff. And we didn't. There was no way. We were so busy. Like our belief in our ability to kind of deliver a story on this really compressed timeline, because we waited until the last minute to make this decision. But there was one thing we could do. We had talked about the Scorpion Clan coup almost from the beginning of the game. And there had been enough fiction and enough kind of backstory written, even if it was just internal, emails or faxes between people about what the events were of the Scorpion Clan coup, that we could do the Scorpion Clan coup as a product because we had enough stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And making that set, I'm not even going to defend it. I don't think it was a good decision. I'm not saying it wasn't a good decision to keep making Legend of the Five Rings, but that set, the Scorpion Clan coup, is not a very good product. For one thing, I don't like prequels in general, just as a rule of thumb. And over the years, I have really hardened my opinion on that. But this was 30 years ago, and my opinion wasn't that hard, right? But we had this mechanic in the game, which was experience. And cards got experienced, which means they got cooler. Well, for Scorpion Clan coup, we made inexperienced versions of the cards. We made less cool versions of cards that people had seen before because it was them at a younger age and before, other things had happened. Now, mechanically, that sounds harmless, right? But from the standpoint of trying to make people excited and want to buy something, you're like, yeah, here's this character you've followed for all this time and you really know. And oh, by the way, here he is when he was young and weak and didn't have any skills. Have fun. Yeah. So the Scorpion Clan coup is essentially, it is a prequel to the Clan War storyline. And it was written by the same people at the same time as the storyline that everybody's familiar with from the Clan War that outlines the plot, the big beats of the story of the Scorpion Clan coup. So in that sense, it's original and authentic to the original creative spark that birthed the Imperial Edition. But it was done kind of as an answer to the question of what are we going to do now in the situation we put ourselves in by planning to end this thing and then deciding we couldn't end it. And that's where the Scorpion Clan coup came from. So of all the stuff that's come after in Legend of the Five Rings history, there's 3 releases in the Scorpion Clan coup. Those 3 releases are weird. They definitely, I think, stick out to people that have been following the franchise and care a lot about the story. It's obvious that something weird happened. And that's the weird thing. We were ready to end. We were serious about doing that until we weren't.
That is also very Scorpion, though, to, go a little bit back on your word and be a little bit sneaky about things.
Yeah.
So I will say that at the Day of Thunder, Ryan and I were sitting there watching the finale and the thing that was happening at the booth. And I will never forget Ryan reaching down and squeezing my arm and saying, "You're right. This property is so loved that I'm glad that we're going to continue to tell this story." So even though we struggled with that decision, we are really happy with the path that L5R went on that got us to this interview.
Yeah. I was about to say, there's generations of fans that came after who, got to appreciate the IP and the game, the role-playing game. I'm one of them. I wouldn't have, I was too young to enjoy the card game when it was coming out, but then I got on board and I fell in love with the role-playing game later on. So I think everybody listening to this podcast is glad that the 2 of you fought and decided to go back on your marketing promise. I know that must have, I don't know, did anyone call you out, or did it seem like everybody?
A lot of people.
Oh, yeah. There were people who would become our friends who were no longer our friends.
Wow.
They were mad. Sorry, Ryan, I didn't mean to step on your...
No, that's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah, it was a friendship ending thing. People were very unhappy. But again, it was okay, 20% of the fan base was really unhappy. Maybe another 20% was kind of not really happy, but it was okay. And then 60% were like, yeah, what are you talking about? Don't end this thing. You'd be crazy to do that. We want to keep going.
Well, I'm really hoping that we can keep going for many more years now, and that this is not the last anniversary celebration that L5R gets to enjoy. I really appreciate both of you, like I said before, taking the time out of your busy days to come chat with me, to reminisce, to celebrate 30 years of L5R and all of the incredible artists, designers, writers, marketers, logistics, printers, everyone who had a hand in it. It's just it's a saga is really what it comes down to, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it sure is.
I was saying before we started this interview, I definitely feel this way. This is, a legacy product. It will be around and talked about for years after we are gone, right? It's got that much of a foothold in this moment in time. And I think the things that I see that are possible for it in the future will just continue to do that.
Yep.
We were talking yesterday about memories of L5R, and Luke Peterschmidt and the team up at Wizards of the Coast hosted a 10,000th card party in LA, and they brought in taiko drummers, and it was this gigantic meal, and it was it was very, very Wizards of the Coast level event. And my parents were both very sort of active in supporting me and moving into gaming. And they came down to that event. And it was amazing to see my parents get a standing ovation from the people that were there. I'm such a teary person. I get teared up when I'm thinking about the great moments that L5R has brought to me and my family and all those great friends that I've got because of it. So I want to thank Luke and the team for putting on that party and giving me that special memory with my parents, which I will never forget.
Yeah. I guess one thing that has really struck me in talking with both of you is how much L5R is really a part of you and a part of your careers professionally in the industry. And it kind of sounds like it's made you the people that you are today in a certain respect.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yep, no doubt. It certainly forged a friendship between Ryan and I that has lasted Like, it's stronger now than it was back then. And it was immensely strong back when we were young and trying to figure out how to, survive in the crazy CCG market.
You talked about the lost promo card bundle that saved the company.
How deep into this story can I get? So I'm not going to go into the whole aspect of the thing, but Ryan wasn't working with Alderac Entertainment Group at the time, and the company was in trouble. And I didn't know it. And I brought Ryan in to really do a deep dive and do that thing that he does to sort of figure out what was going on. And I flew to Europe to meet with the different communities of L5R players over in Europe. And I went to Spain and met with the Spanish players, and they threw this party, and I was with my wife, and it was amazing. And then I went to France, and they threw a French party, and it was amazing. And then I went to Germany, and they threw it. And I was talking to Ryan. He's like, yeah, you've got problems. I don't know how bad they are, but things are really bad. Mm. And then I went to Germany, and we met with the German players, and they threw an amazing German party. And at the German party, they set up this table in the front where they had me and my wife sat at this table. And all the parties had been so much fun to go to, and everything was great. And then the German players, who loved L5R to their core, lined up in what I call the receiving line of, I call it a bad word that I can't repeat here on the thing, but it was a horrifying moment for me as the owner of Legends of Five Rings and AEG. The German players got in the line, and they came up to me and told me everything that we were doing wrong. And it was in the most polite and nice way. You said that you were going to do this. I couldn't do this. I couldn't get my Koku cards. I couldn't do this. I mean, it was just this list of things that we were doing badly. And there was a little break in the action, but like Ryan squeezing my arm at the Day of Thunder for the good thing, I remember my wife squeezing my hand underneath the table and saying, "Is it always this bad?" And I said, "It has never been this bad." And after that event, like where I realized that was back at the time when we were in trouble with our partners, it was because we were doing a bad job. And I called Ryan, and Ryan said, "Yeah, you got to come home. Your company is dead. Like, it really is dead." And in Ryan's mind, it was so dead that there wasn't anything that I could do. And for me, I'm hopeful. Like, I'm always like, there has to be a way that we can save the business, right? I'm like, how bad is it? He's like, it's so bad. It's like, you can't fix it. You just need to close the company and do the thing. And like, again, we got to this point where he went back to Seattle. We talked on the phone, and then we ended up at an Alliance open house together. And at a Steak and Shake with Luke Peterschmidt, I got into a fight with Ryan, and I'm screaming at him in the Steak and Shake, "Just tell me how bad it is. I just need a number." And he's like, "It's so bad. It's horrible." And he didn't want to tell me how bad it was. And like, I'm screaming at Luke, and I'm screaming at him like, "Luke, tell him to tell me how bad it is." He's like, "I don't want to." He's like, "John, you need to generate," it was hundreds of thousands. Like, you need to magically generate like $300,000 to $500,000 in revenue to save your company. And like, I immediately went, "Oh man, that really is as bad as you said it was. There's no way that I can save the business." And so I flew home to California, and we let a number of people go. It was like the worst time. And I was starting to clear things out in the back of the office. We had a warehouse that we called the Shadowlands. And I started moving these pallets of what I thought were demo decks out into the back thing. And I went inside, and I asked one of them, I'm like, "I found these cards. What are these cards?" And there were boxes, like Ryan described, of promo cards. Because when we would print an expansion, there were always extra cards at the bottom of the sheet that didn't go into the expansion that we put promo cards on. And the plan was we would use those promo cards for Koku and for other things. And for years, the cards had just been being put onto a pallet and put out into the Shadowlands. And there were like 50 unique cards or some crazy number that players had never seen. And so Ryan says, "And then a miracle happened" is not a business plan, John. And then a miracle happened. I took all of those cards and figured out that we might be able to sell them to players as a sort of direct-to-player Christmas special offering. And I mean, this is a great way to end this conversation. You didn't even know that the L5R players saved our business, saved it. Like they bought enough of those cards to
Wow.
cover a majority of that hole that we had dug for ourselves and gave us enough runway
That's incredible.
to make better decisions and become, a better company after that. And so I horrified that our company got into that position, and unbelievably thankful that the L5R community rewarded us with the opportunity to continue to publish games and go on.
It's like an incredible comeback story, like a tale from the tournaments almost, where you think you're like this close.
Yep.
And then you pull out the one card that you needed in that exact moment to save you.
Yep, that's it. And then a miracle happened. I thank those German players for that moment forever. I'm so glad they did it.
Yeah, they're definitely known to be direct and, but they want to help.
Yeah, and it was super helpful because if they had not done that, I would not have realized that one of the reasons why we were failing is because we were doing a bad job. Because you can fool yourself into believing that it's not your fault that things are going in a bad direction. And that moment was a real eye opener for me and for the team at AEG to understand that, in order to be a game company and be a business that is supposed to give people fun, you are making a commitment to doing a much better job than what we were doing at that time. So amazing.
Yeah. Fall down 7 times, stand back up 8.
There you go.
And I think that proverb suits the franchise well, since L5R has had its ups and downs over the years, but it keeps on going. We were so lucky to have Ryan and John talk with us about those early years, and I hope you'll stay with us for the series as I interview other guests who left their mark on Rokugan and whose lives were changed by the game. Until next time. This audio recording is copyright Asmodee North America Incorporated, 2025. All rights reserved. Produced and published by Aconyte Books. Legend of the Five Rings and the Legend of the Five Rings logo are trademarks or registered trademarks of Asmodee North America. Stay up to date with all the news from Rokugan and sign up for the official newsletter at l5r.com. Subscribe to the Play to Win podcast from Aconyte Books for more episodes of 30 Years of Legend of the Five Rings.